Good evening. How are you doing? How are you doing? Thank you, thank you. So my name is Eric Fernholm, and I'll be the host or moderator for this evening, and we have a very exciting hour ahead of us. I sneak peeked the slides. Super cool stuff. So the reason why we're having this event here is mostly because of a network of enthusiasts who just had the first ever conference on psychedelic psychiatry this weekend, actually, which is a kind of interesting thing to happen in Sweden. So as you guys heard, the Norrsken Foundation in the video shown is very much exploring how could we use technology to enable those who want to have a bigger impact in the world. Redefining success from just being about me to actually interconnecting that to success being about a bigger picture. So part of that is, of course, in our day and age, a lot about mental health. So if you look to the person on your left and then on your right, so 1 out of you 3 people, if you had somebody on your left or your right, will suffer from depression during your lifetime. Clinical, disabling depression. Insane. We've had an 800% increase in so serious sleeping disorders among kids in Sweden in just a couple of years that we have to medicate them. An 800% of increase in prescribing melatonin. Insane. So looking at the statistics in Sweden, we see that mental health is quite a big problem. 11% of the Swedish population today are on antidepressants. That's a large chunk of us in this room. It's insane. So seeing that trend, exploring novel evidence-based approaches to exploring cures or betterments or treatments is something that Norrsken and myself think is, of course, very, very interesting. But to be completely honest with you guys, I got the question of like, do you want to moderate this? Do you want to moderate a conference on psychedelic mushrooms at Norrsken House? I was like, are we seriously going to have a conference session about mushrooms at Norrsken House? And we had a lot of serious discussions, and I was thinking deeply about this. Because what we've seen is researchers being ostracized from the research community just because they published a paper on this. It's happened. We've had public speakers in Sweden who get more or less kicked out of events because they said something about maybe we shouldn't just judge all the drugs into one category and just say all are bad. So the space for exploring something like this is kind of mined territory, and the consequences can be quite grave. But keeping that in mind, our conclusion, my conclusion at least, was if we can't have discussions about super serious topics that have both risks and potential opportunities in them, we're probably going down the wrong road. So in that kind of belief, we said, hey, the world is getting more complex, and what we probably need to do is become better listeners and not just kind of projecting our ideas or prejudices on each other. So if you are super engaged and love psychedelics, if you're an enthusiast, maybe tonight could be an invitation to look at that enthusiasm through a critical lens and say, maybe we should step back, maybe we could be over-enthusiastic. Or if you're super skeptic, maybe tonight and the researchers and perspectives that you will take part of could enable you to think, maybe there is a lost opportunity, and only looking at this through a critical perspective. So, with that said, I would love to invite our kind of guide into this topic, and I'll give you guys the background. So, in a minute, I'll invite up Alex Belser, Dr. Alex Belser, sorry. who is a psychologist and a clinical research fellow at Yale University, founding member of the Psychedelic Research Group at New York University, adjunct professor at New York University, and study therapist for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for post-traumatic stress disorder. Interesting stuff. So welcome up, Alex. Thank you.
Oh, it works. Okay. Hi, everybody. My name's Alex. It's really lovely to be here. I want to thank Norrsken House, I apologize, for hosting us.
Nailed it.
It's fantastic. And I met Philip Bromberg. Where's Philip? Yeah, right in front of me. And well, maybe before, but in San Francisco, you asked me, come out to Sweden. We'd like to have you for this colloquium on psychedelic psychiatry. If you were in the audience at the colloquium this last weekend, it was a 2-day event. Can you just raise your hand? Okay, so we had a good showing of people. Now raise your hand if this is the first time you've ever attended a talk on any sort of psychedelic science or medicine. Oh my goodness, okay. I say, oh my goodness, because this means I have to do something, I have to be good about this. I only have 10 minutes to present research, so forgive me, there's no way I can really present the rich research that's happened. The Swedish Network for Psychedelic Science and Philip and the rest of the amazing group who are here today have been so kind to us and hosted us and have helped us think about the nature of our research and practice, and I feel incredibly grateful to all of you. So if I can find the clicker, oh, in my pocket, I'll get started. So I just want to share, I do receive funding from a variety of different grant sources or consultation sources in this area. But I want to start by focusing not on all psychedelic medicines, although we'll have other panelists here with specialty in MDMA, and I am working with MDMA, or ketamine, or ayahuasca, or other substances, but focusing on mushrooms, on psilocybin. How many people here have ever gone mushroom hunting? Yeah? Okay. I'd never done it until 2 days ago, so you're way ahead of me. So psilocybin breaks down into psilocin in the human brain. It's, as you see, very chemically similar to serotonin. It's active in the serotonergic receptors of the mind at the 5-HT2A and 2C receptor sites. If I were to ask you what is the most harmful substance, a recreational drug used to people, what would you say? Yes, alcohol. Psychedelics on the whole tend to be rated as very low risk to self and others. This is a study published in The Lancet by David Nutt and colleagues in the UK, a number of British researchers. It's since been replicated by other researchers showing alcohol is the highest, then heroin, crack cocaine, and methamphetamine. Harms from mushrooms are at the very bottom of the list. Minimal harms, and what we see in our clinical research settings is that the harms can be easily mitigated by a supportive context, mindset, intention, and support from a therapy team. The nice thing about psychedelics is it's very hard to overdose on them. Here we have the active dose versus lethal dose ratio. Heroin is the most difficult here. You don't have to take too much more heroin to overdose. It's very difficult to overdose on substances like LSD or psilocybin, very low active dose to lethal dose range. We also find in both animal studies, human studies, epidemiological studies, that people do not form habitual habit-forming addictive patterns with most of these substances, certainly not with psilocybin. So this measure here is dependence potential. So we see that nicotine, morphine, and heroin have very high dependence, but substances like mushrooms have very low dependence. In fact, you can't take them multiple days in a row and achieve the same effect. We find that, I don't need you to read all of this, but the basic short line of this is that a large pooled analysis was run of all of the different psilocybin trials that are happening to look at safety and tolerability. And what we find on the whole is that although these substances do produce profound changes in consciousness, affect, mood, interpersonal patterns, and lasting effects and changes in clinical symptomatology, what we see is that we have no serious adverse events, no hospitalizations. We never had to administer an antidote drug to stop the session from occurring. And in follow-up, this reveals no subsequent drug abuse, no persisting perceptual issues for people, no prolonged psychosis or other sort of impairment in functioning. So the research is happening all over the world, and I would be curious, and I've been talking with some Swedish academics about it potentially happening in Stockholm. But we see research happening, particularly at Johns Hopkins University, where a number of studies have come out in Baltimore, Maryland, where my family is from, but a number of other state schools in the United States, including Wisconsin and Birmingham, University of Arizona. In London, a great number of trials are coming out of Imperial College. Our work at NYU School of Medicine, headed up by Dr. Steve Ross, who's in the audience here, and some other colleagues, Elizabeth Nielsen, on that team as well. University of New Mexico, in San Francisco at UCSF, Harbor UCLA, Dr. Charles Grobe is in the audience, who's done some fantastic work in a variety of areas. And Alicia will be a presenter here in a moment, and Yale, more recently with depression. But also in a number of places in Europe, including in the University of Zurich, for example. So the short course, and I'm just going to tell you this as best I understand it, we know that psychedelic mushrooms and other psychedelic plants and compounds were used on the 6 inhabited continents that humans have lived on throughout multiple ages and times. There's anthropological evidence suggesting this everywhere. Mushrooms, psychedelic mushrooms grow basically on all the 6 continents, and we see widespread evidence for ritual use. So for example, here are some mushroom photographs. Here are from the Central and South American context. These are from Colombia, from the Sinu culture around 1200 to 1600 Common Era in gold. These are mushroom stones which were found by the hundreds in the Yucatan area. Many of these were destroyed by Spanish colonialists. And here we see a man eating mushrooms. Here we see another man holding mushrooms. So with the advent of colonialism, much of the indigenous use goes underground. In the history of psychiatry in the 1950s and 60s, we see that hallucinogen research is a huge part of psychiatry. By 1965, over 1,000 papers were published, maybe up to quite a bit higher than that, with over 40,000 individuals who had received substances like psilocybin, LSD. Mostly open label methodology, but what happens in 1970? Richard Nixon in the United States signs the Controlled Substances Act into law, in large measure as a response to the hippie movement in the psychedelic 60s, and also largely thought to be driven by a way to control people of color in the United States. The law becomes propagated and becomes a model law and is taken up around the globe by many countries. So I just want to go through this real quickly. We have evidence in the culture, not only is psilocybin safe, but we see that people who use psychedelics not in randomized clinical trials have less suicidality, they have less psychological distress. Individuals who have been incarcerated show lower rates of recidivism and lower rates of intimate partner violence, domestic violence, than other people. So for example, this is for psychological distress. Lifetime classical psychedelic use is the only substance compared to cocaine use, stimulants, sedatives, tranquilizers, heroin, that shows a protective effect against psychological distress. This is in a study of 190,000 Americans, adults, 190,000 people. All the other drugs either have no effect on psychological distress or are a risk factor. We see the same thing with suicide attempt and suicidal thinking and intent. Lifetime classical psychedelic use is protective. This holds true in a controlled model for over a dozen different controls. Have you guys heard of Alcoholics Anonymous? Right. So this is the leading peer sort of treatment for AA. Its founder was a man named Bill W., sometimes called Belladonna Bill. Belladonna Bill, he drank alcohol and wanted to start AA. But his cure from alcoholism occurred during a belladonna session, which is a type of psychedelic agent. He also received LSD treatment from Sidney Cohen, and he wanted in the original bylaws of AA to allow people to not use drugs, but to use psychedelics as a therapeutic modality. And we see this history for alcohol use disorder. Our colleague at NYU, Michael Bogenschutz, has done a lot of work on alcohol use disorder. And so here, for example, is his initial pilot data on 10 people. These are people who have drink a lot. They spend 30 to 45% of their days during heavy drinking. This is 5 or more drinks, I believe. The first treatment session with psilocybin happens here. You see a profound drop-off in the percentage of time, days during their week that they're engaged in heavy drinking. You see very similar results with smoking cessation. So this is a study of trying to quit smoking. If you guys have ever tried to quit smoking, it's very difficult. People often try and fail over and over and over again. And we also look at cocaine dependence. In this study of smoking cessation, they took biomarkers at Hopkins with 15 people. So this is actually exhaled carbon monoxide, and this is in the urine, urinary cotinine, which are biomarkers of having smoked. And they had 80% success rate in helping people to quit. These are individual trajectories that after psilocybin go down. There's quite a bit of work ramping up for depression. I'm presenting small-scale trials, but both in Europe and in the United States, very large-scale trials, phase 3 trials are planned centering around depression or treatment-resistant depression on both continents, and this will involve hundreds of participants at dozens of treatment facilities. But we see it's a very helpful psychotherapeutic modality for depression. This was published in the Lancet Psychiatry. And here, this is the score of depression. This is the Beck Depression Inventory. These are individual scores. So these people were all in the severe depression range. And after one treatment of psilocybin 1 week later, most of them are in the no depression range. There's also a variety of other studies happening around that. So psilocybin has a unique signature for psychedelics. So this is a altered states of consciousness measured scale. So you sort of see a little fingerprint for each of these. So this is things like visual alterations, vivid imagery, an experience of unity, a blissful state. Ketamine, which is another powerful and useful psychedelic, has a different signature. How does this work? So there's a number of different mediators that could be helpful. So for example, we see bioneurological mechanisms with the 5-HT2A site. We also see increased AMPA. We see increases in BDNF with a variety of these substances, which promotes neuroplasticity, neurogeneration in the brain and spine. We see different DMN activity. So DMN is a brain network that when you do neuroimaging, you can actually see that the human brain systems are responding differently to the psychedelics. And we also see changes in inflammation in the body. So the idea that most psychedelics, are, at least serotonergic psychedelics, are very profound and acute anti-inflammatory agents. Charles Nichols, who's Dave Nichols' son, who's also here in the audience, is spearheading that effort. But in addition to these neurobiological mechanisms, we have this idea that something is happening. Perhaps some of you know people who've taken psychedelics. Surely no one in this room. But what you find out is that people have oftentimes very profound experiences of meaning. They often come to new understandings. So my work, my research is about interviewing people in depth. Tell me, let's sit down for 2 hours and tell me what happened for you in this experience. And share with me what it is. And many people say they had a profound religious or spiritual or mystical experience. And that has been shown time and time again to be a mediator of the reductions in anxiety, the reductions in depression, the reductions in drinking, for example. So I'm going to share with you a little bit. I'm going to skip ahead. This is a study with obsessive compulsive disorder, which is very promising and needs to be replicated and built out. Baseline scores down to OCD. OCD is very difficult to treat, and we had some good showing here. I want to share a little bit with the cancer patients that we were working with at NYU. So these are individuals who had diagnosis of cancer, but also had clinical anxiety and or depression related to their cancer diagnosis. It's very difficult to deal with chemotherapy, surgery, all the loss of function that comes with becoming quite ill from cancer, and it often brings up existential crises and questions for people. So 30 to 40% of patients in hospital settings have enduring clinically significant anxiety or depression. So it's not just cancer. You get cancer and then you get the double whammy of anxiety and depression on top of that oftentimes. It's associated with a variety of poor outcomes, and there's no, in the United States, FDA-approved pharmacotherapy to treat this, because you give people SSRIs, like Prozac, they tend not to do very well, actually. They tend not to get better with this particular type of distress, existential distress. So our study is based largely on a protocol written by Dr. Charles Grobe. And what we see in, I'm not going to show you photographs of our room, although we could talk about it, is a very strong antidepressant and anxiolytic or anti-anxiety response. So 58% of our participants in the psilocybin group, this is a randomized controlled trial, 2 groups, 58% of our participants versus only 14% in our placebo group had an anti-anxiety response after 7 weeks. It's a crossover design, so which means that I can only compare them at 7 weeks, although we did do long-term outcomes. For depression, we see that 83% of our participants in the psilocybin group showed antidepressant response. These are very large magnitude effect sizes. In the long-term follow-up at 6.5 months, we see that response rates, including significant reductions in anxiety and depression, are in the 60 to 80% range, which, if you're familiar with research in this area, is really quite large and unusual and is difficult to explain. And many people don't really believe the findings at first, and so we want to learn more about what is going on. Here are some of our graphs. So this is the Beck depression inventory, percentage of the participants who are with scores for depression. You see 1 day post-session 1. In the treatment group, you have a very large remission in depression of over 80%. And this continues out to 26 weeks. Here you see some charts. So this group got psilocybin, this group did not get psilocybin. And here, these are effect sizes. So for standard SSRIs in the United States, you have to have a effect size of 0.3 in order to be considered for a legal drug. In the UK, they're moving to 0.5. This is about equivalent or a little better than placebo, just giving a sugar pill. But our effect sizes here, and you see this in a lot of psychedelic research, are greater than 1 or around 1. So Cohen's D effect size of 1, which means that an entire standard deviation shift in the treatment sample in terms of better scores on anxiety and depression scales. And then these are enduring. So this marker here is 26 weeks later. At this point, both groups, this group as well, also gets psilocybin, and both scores tend to have significantly higher, significant response and symptom reduction for depression. We see very similar results for anxiety. So for anxiety, also we start here. Both groups come down to here after both groups receive treatment. And this is on 3 different measures of anxiety. So it's not just a single measure. We're trying to measure this as best we can. The last thing I'll say on this is it's not just the clinical symptoms. So we see some really interesting findings that people felt better in a variety of measures. They had significantly improved cancer-related demoralization. They felt more hopeful. They reported greater spiritual well-being. They reported a higher quality of life. They also had better positive attitudes about themselves and about their life. They reported increased altruism, a measure of pro-social behavior. And these differences don't just last for a few days. This is one medicine session, not multiple medicine sessions. One medicine session at 6.5 to 8 months, these differences are sustained and are still significant. When you ask people how personally meaningful was this experience to you, we see that 70% of people rated their experience as the singular or among the top 5 most meaningful experiences of their entire lives. So the Hopkins group has put this on par with the birth of a child, or your wedding day, or the death of a loved one. And people speak quite powerfully about their experiences. So I'm gonna close. How much time do I have? Like 1 minute? Yeah, okay. just to give you a sense, I gave you a very dry presentation because I feel like it's important to show that there's serious science being done about this. But I do want to invite the voice of our patients in. So I interviewed a bunch of people, and instead of reading this, I interviewed 13 people, and I'm going to show you just a little one quotation from each of them, right? So I'm not cherry picking the best of the best. I interviewed 13 people in a row. These were the last 13 people that took psilocybin in our cancer trial. And here's what each of them said, one selection from each of the 13 participants. I felt completely at peace and whole and loved. I felt so loved and understood and forgiving. I can go into myself and find peace and comfort. It's there. So I am changed by this, and in pretty significant ways. I felt connected to myself. I felt more self-love and a feeling of love for humanity very deeply. It's the first time I ever really felt like I was part of the world instead of separate from it. This woman said, it was like being inside of a drop of water, being inside of a butterfly's wing, and being inside of a cheetah's eyes. Words fail me. This man said he felt bathed in universal love. It was such a strong feeling. This person described it as being like pushing a reset button. It makes you question everything about yourself, figure out what you want to change, what you want to keep the same, what is good, what is bad. You know how to really integrate things in your life, and I think that has a very lasting effect. This person, after cancer treatment, said, I have a restored ease with life. The percentage of my life that I am able to be present in just a moment has increased dramatically. This person had a profound vision, and many of our participants report visual experiences or felt embodied vision experiences. I felt like that was my umbilical cord to the universe, and that she was thinking about her own death. This was where my life would be drained from me someday, and I would surrender it willingly when my time came, and that was just so profound. And then also that, and I started hearing, I choose this. I choose this knowing how it would end. Participant 5. Part of this was I've come out of it not afraid of cancer. And that's a pretty life-affirming thing for me. I'll let you read this one. It felt so moving to sit down and speak with patients, obviously, because they are going through, some of them, a severe death process or struggling with their cancer diagnosis. Number 3, how do you explain infinity? What do I tell you? What word do you want me to use to explain infinity? Because that is what I am feeling. I am experiencing infinity. Number 2, participant number 2. You just see with your own eyes that that's what's happened. That's what happens after you lose your body, and there is nothing to be afraid of. And number 1, my heart was an energetic field that I was able to work with. There was no sense of the theoretical mental gymnastics. It was all in the realm of the heart, and that's where the whole thing took place. So I'd like to thank you for your time, and I'm excited to join the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'd love to invite the rest of the panel. I'll invite them one by one and give them just a short introduction. So first, I would love to invite up Alicia Danforth, who is a clinical psychologist, a clinical researcher, who started at Harbor UCLA Medical Center and is now currently at UC San Francisco. Thank you. Thanks for being here. And then Mats Humle, Senior Lecturer in Psychiatry at Örebro University. Thank you. And lastly, Alexander Lebedev, a psychiatrist and brain imaging researcher, also assistant professor at the Department of Clinical Neuroscience at KI. Thank you. Okay, so we have two voices in the panel representing, I guess, maybe more this kind of Swedish perspective, or scene at least, and 2 from a more international background. Thanks to all of you for being here and taking the time out for this event. So before we open up for questions from the audience, we'd actually love to kind of condense and reflect a little bit on what has been said. So who wants to go first? What kind of popped up in you when you're hearing all of this?
I can start as an intermediate Swede.
Yes.
I think it's fascinating. I think, and those of you who don't know, Alex has also done some amazing work trying to dissect the experiences that he was talking about today, comparing psilocybin-induced mystical type experiences with indigenously occurring ones. I think it's fascinating in terms of that there is a general tendency in our branch of medicine to pathologize human experiences, and I think this could be an antidote to that. That was great, Alex. Thank you very much. That was an excellent talk.
Nice. Matt, do you want to jump in?
Yes, I can say that it's really very
Yeah. Oh. No. Yeah. Psychiatry needs new treatment, and I've been aware of this for a long time, and I've been looking for new treatments since the 90s, I would say, because
I think it's me interfering, no?
it was clear at that time that yeah.
Nice.
In spite of new antidepressant drugs, there were many patients with depression that didn't have good effects from these treatments, and to me it was an eye-opener when the results with ketamine were published in United States. I think it was 2006, and I think I was the first psychiatrist in Sweden that tried ketamine treatment for depressed patients. Actually, it was an article in Aftonbladet. They labeled it horse medicine against depression, because ketamine is used by veterinaries when they operate on horses. And then I was waiting for this, because the new thing was that you have a immediate effect. I mean, this within 1 hour you see a positive effect, and this was unknown to psychiatrists before that, and it's sort of similar to the effects you describe with psychedelics, and I thought this could be implemented rather rapidly in Swedish psychiatry, but now it's gone 10 years since we first reported on this, and the authorities have been sort of hesitating how to say the guidelines for treatment in Sweden, and we still don't have any clear guidelines on the possible use of ketamine. As I've understood, in United States, it's spreading more or less non-serious use of ketamine, also in clinical practice, which might be important to be aware of. And I think when we have new treatments, it's really important that they are taken care of in a responsible way, so we don't mess up this signal of really useful effects, and this is they have done it very much with ketamine in Sweden. I mean, it's still not used in clinics, but maybe it's even more important in the case of psychedelics. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Matt.
Thanks.
And I think it applies to the entire field,
Yeah.
that there is this kind of course, from your presentation, also this potential, but then the also worrisome kind of over-enthusiasm that can be surrounded around it. Alicia, do you want to share any reflections or thoughts that came up?
Sure. Can you hear me? One thing that struck me as I was watching your presentation is how delicate it can be in presenting these results from clinical studies when we're called upon to provide the subjective accounts of the participants, because sometimes in science it's frowned upon to try to persuade by an appeal to the emotions. And it's very difficult in any other way to explain to people who are new to this approach to psychiatry what these medications are doing without providing those testimonial accounts. I thought you did a really outstanding job, Alex, by just picking one statement. But I can tell you from my experience working on research with psilocybin-assisted therapy for anxiety reactive to late stage cancer and providing MDMA-assisted therapy for social anxiety in autistic adults, and currently providing psilocybin-assisted therapy in a group therapy model for long-term HIV/AIDS survivors who are experiencing demoralization. We see similar statements across all of these studies. I think it's always important in presenting on this research to educate on both the quantitative findings, the data and the numbers, but this field of science has an extra demand to be very sensitive to the qualitative, because people aren't talking about mystical experiences for their cholesterol medication. They're not talking about awe and beauty and seeing through a cheetah's eyes and so on. So I think it's imperative to just start thinking in entirely new ways about this approach to treatment and being very open to the softer side of science as well. The data and numbers are essential and very important, but I'm glad this evening that you got a taste of the qualitative experience of the people who receive the medications and can see how it does require a new paradigm to hold that.
So listening in to the data, and also I had a short run around the conference this weekend, like looking into these results. I mean, what you showed there, and the research that I think all of you have been involved in. Like, what is going on? Like, seriously, what is going on? I mean, because these results are, I mean, it's better than a lot of the treatments. I mean, the sample sizes are small, but the indicators, if we see them as just as indicators, why do you guys think, if you could guess, because this is a hard question, especially for researchers, why do you think that we are seeing these results? Have any idea?
Why do we see the such big therapeutic effects?
Yes.
Yeah, first of all, commenting on what's going on. I think what's going on is the exponential growth, as was also nicely pointed out in the initial presentation of this place. I think it's going on pretty much everywhere, and psychedelic research is not an exception. Approximately a year ago, I did the search into major clinical trial registries. So, and if you are to run a clinical trial, you are obligated to register your clinical trial either in the United States website or the European one. And by the end of 2016, there were only 4 registered clinical trials. By the end of the next year, 2017, there was an exponential growth. 74 clinical trials were registered. So we see that it's occurring at a very fast pace. But answering the question, what's going on, discussing effects of psychedelics with different practitioners. And by the way, I had a little bit of involvement in psychedelic research as a part of my collaboration with the Imperial College group. But what is interesting is that no matter what kind of school a particular therapist is affiliated with, they all say that psychedelic-assisted therapy fits very nicely into any model. So any psychotherapist who is interested in psychedelics and observes effects can find an explanation from their own perspectives. There are a number of physiological models that have been proposed that under the influence of psychedelics, the brain enters in a very unusual states of neurodynamics. So usually when during our daily consciousness, when we are awake, when we interact with others, the brain is, roughly speaking, divided in a number of networks that sometimes interact, but interact very little. Your visual stream is relatively independent of your motor stream, and different networks and there's observation of attention. But in general, the networks are relatively segregated from each other, and what's going on during the psychedelic state is that the networks that do not interact or interact very little, they start cross-talking a lot more. Now, we know that some psychopathological states, like, for example, depression, it has been experimentally demonstrated that it is linked to very rigid states of brain dynamics. It's very inflexible states of brain dynamics. But again, what psychedelics do, they do the opposite. They enhance the repertoire of brain dynamics. And ultimately, after this enhancement, after this increase of interaction between the networks that normally crosstalk very little, ultimately the brain can land in a very different state afterwards. And that's what's fascinating. That's what makes these drugs unique, that they can make such a profound effect on the brain and the brain dynamics, and ultimately lead to qualitatively, quantitatively different states of brain dynamics and subjective experiences.
Yeah, I once heard a researcher say something similar, where they used a metaphor of the frontal lobes being like the CEO of the brain, and basically being more like a filter, saying like shutting down influences from like information coming in. I mean, we're only conscious of 40 bits of information every second, but we're taking in 2 million bits of information. So CEO is basically a filter. And this researcher made a metaphor that, like, when you look into the neuroimaging results, you see that when people go into these pathological states, it's very rigid, like CEO, like controlling top-down waterfall approach, and getting stuck in those patterns. But when you put them into these types of experiences, it is basically firing your CEO and moving into this kind of Nordic flat model and just letting stuff flow.
Pretty much. Yeah.
What would the rest of you, would you, Alex, what would you say? You guys are smiling. Would you say that that is even a reasonable metaphor, or just bad?
I guess it depends on who your CEO is.
Maybe. Good answer.
So my training is as a psychologist, not a psychiatrist. But my understanding of a lot of the research is that there's really no modern psychiatry, and large pharmaceutical production companies have largely given up on mental health treatments, or especially new lines of research development in mental health treatments. The existing therapies don't work very well for many people, except, for example, for SSRIs. They work well for people with severe depression, but tend not to work very well for many people with moderate to mild depression. And of course, there's a number of side effects, like sexual side effects and weight gain for people with depression. And then you have difficulty going off of this, the SSRIs when you wish to discontinue. And as a psychologist, I often work with patients who are attenuating their use of SSRIs or SNRIs over time. Psychedelics, and these are also medications you take every day, right? You take your pill every day. Psychedelics, we're looking at treatment models where you take psilocybin once, or maybe up to 3 times in many of the current studies. And we're seeing long-term changes. So something is happening. And to your question about what is happening, this is the question on everyone's lips in large measure. What are the mediators of the experience? What are the mechanisms of action? There seem to be a number of really interesting and novel neurobiological mechanisms on one level as a correlate. But there's also, but what we see and when we interview our patients is that they have these profound experiences of like hitting a reset in their lives, experiences of forgiving people that they've been angry with and separated with for years in these experiences, a way of reconceiving their identity and relationship to their work, to their world, to their spiritual self in some important way, what it means to be a human alive in this time. People often ask these very big questions. We're not necessarily asking these big questions in the therapy, but we are hopefully providing a supportive place for people to come and to do some deeper work. So the other thing I'll say is I didn't show any photos, but in almost all of these treatment models, the patient in this context is working usually with two therapists. So it's, and they have talk therapy before the actual medication session with psilocybin or MDMA, and then they have integration sessions afterwards. So it's not just that you're getting the medicine. These are all in a carefully thought out and well-intentioned place, a beautiful setting for the couch with music and eye shades. We encourage people to close their eyes and to go into their own experience. So they're not involved with the room or like a dance club. That's a different type of setting. We encourage people to go inside and see what they find there and to navigate that experience. And they get a lot of support before, and they get a lot of support after. So we don't work with people if they don't feel safe, and if they haven't established a bond of trust with their therapy team, as Alicia, I'm sure you can relate to, yes.
Yeah, I always struggle when I'm asked about mechanism of action because classic psychedelics and MDMA have multiple mechanisms of action, and as a clinician, I always start with the individual I'm working with, and I think this is another one of the large, not necessarily a challenge, but an opportunity to approach psychiatric medicine in a new way that's highly individualized. What is this individual before me now needing, or what have they expressed about what they're wanting for their own healing? These substances, in the case of MDMA, it's very dose dependent. So Dr. Nichols pointed out to me at one time that people make such a big deal about, serotonin and MDMA, but we've found actually in one dose range, the primary mechanism of action may be the increased availability of serotonin. It may be the reduction of activation in the amygdala that quiets down the fear response. For someone else at a higher dose range where they're getting more dopamine, that may be helpful if they're struggling with something like body dysmorphic disorder, problems like that. So there's so much variability. It's very difficult to ask that question. How are they doing? What is the mechanism? I think we need to start, really appreciating the value of an individualized approach to medicine and adapting the set and setting accordingly. In the first two studies I worked on, we worked with kind of the more classic model with eye shades and headphones and two co-therapists. The current study we're working on is in a group model because long-term HIV/AIDS survivors often live with profound isolation. So incorporating an opportunity to connect with the community paired with the moderately high-dose psilocybin, just one session, we're already in the early stages seeing a signal of promising effects.
So it sounds like one dose can have very, very significant effects. And that would, from a kind of economic model, that would disencourage a lot of big pharma to even put their money into this, of course. That's just basic market economy, because you can't continually sell doses, and you can pick mushrooms in the woods. One thing that I would want to touch on before we open up for questions from the audience is, so in Sweden there was a recent poll with 1,000 people answering, where it was basically trying to understand their opinions on criminalizing or keeping narcotics, or like all of the illegal drugs basically, and in Swedish that's like narkotika is the word, but it's not directly translated to narcotics. But basically 88% of the respondents said I agree to the idea that a society free from all narcotics, any drug basically, is a good goal. So it's a very different climate than what we're seeing in Norway even, or what we're seeing in the States, of course. But with that in mind, it would be very interesting to hear just your reflections from the panel here. What do you guys see is the risk of exploring this? It seems like we're very early days in the research. What is the risk of exploring this? And also, what is the risk of not exploring this venue? Because this is what the critics say, and they're like, it's a risk of exploring this. And this is what happened in the 60s when they kind of closed down all the research because people maybe went too far with it. So what do you guys say is the risk of exploring it in relation to not exploring it?
As a very short background, I should say, because I mentioned that I'm some sort of an intermediate Swede. I'm in the process of becoming a Swede. I'm actually Russian by origin, and I mean, my country has a history of having a lot of problems with drug abuse and different kinds of drugs. And in that sense, the governmental policies towards drugs are very similar between Russia and Sweden. Speaking about commenting on people's opinions about drugs in general, it's important to keep in mind that there is a general misconception, I would say, existing in society that, well, whatever, if you use something psychoactive or recreationally, then it's necessarily bad. And yet we know that people use alcohol, nicotine on daily basis. And I know that many people do not equal them with other drugs, which is definitely not true. These are drugs, and one of the most dangerous drugs that are the cause of death of many people worldwide. I mean, just look at statistics, how many people die from violent offenses, from suicide, and if you look how many of them were intoxicated by that time with alcohol, it's just insane. Needless to say about nicotine-related issues. So to cut the long story short, I think it's very important to keep in mind that even those who think that like it's the ultimate goal, so I bet that many of them still, would perhaps on the weekend drink a beer or I don't know, smoke a cigarette.
Isn't that interesting to add that when we saw the slide of the damage to yourself and to others from Nutt, that professor, that when he got the mission, this is just me relaying my lay experience or lay understanding of it. Yeah. When he got the mission to dive into and understand the research on the effects of risk for individuals and for others, and when he published the results, he got fired.
Well, and we know the story of David Nutt, right? So what happened? I mean, well, some would say that he was fired for doing his job.
Yeah.
Again, I just want to be clear about that. My own interest in psychedelic research lies primarily in their medical application. And I mean, how can we even talk about drug-free society, because we use psychoactive drugs, well, every day. And for some patients, it's a lifesaver. I mean, it's a game changer. I mean, speaking about antidepressants, there is also, that's a separate story about the ongoing discussion about their efficacy. And I mean, I think both fields have points when it comes to arguing about that. But my point is that, as it has already been pointed out, that there is a large population of psychiatric patients for whom we are not doing a good job. According to different sources, it's up to 30% of treatment-resistant, highly severe psychiatric patients. And actually, my first scientific project that I was a part of as a medical student was focused specifically on these populations. And those were insanely, super highly resistant OCD patients and depressed patients who were undergoing brain surgery, deep brain stimulation surgery. It's the implantation of deep metal electrodes into the brain. and we may have different opinions about that, but those were people at the edge of suicide, really desperate people. My point is that we already do much harsher things to our patients, those who do not respond to treatment. To me, questioning the rationale of this research sounds irrational.
Interesting. So before we open up for questions, does anybody want to add something?
I just wanted to very quickly point about the dangers, because that's also important to keep in mind, because a lot of research that is currently being conducted in the field is driven by highly motivated researchers who are really into the field and are really interested in seeing the bright side of the story, and I'm definitely one of them. I mean, I want to see medical applications of these substances, as a part of treatment of treatment-resistant disorders. But there are dangers associated with that. In general, it doesn't mean that that it is something evil in us. It just means that we are humans. If you are interested in something, there is of course a tendency to desire to see the light when it comes to the outcomes of the studies. And we should of course be very critical of ourselves. And as we discussed during last event at Karolinska, when we were also discussing psychedelic-assisted therapy, I think we should sometimes be very critical about ourselves, and that's the only way to do good science in general. But in defense of that, I should say that we know a very problematic story of SSRI research being funded by pharma industry. And there was a study published in 2016, showing that, for instance, if a meta-analysis, and by the way, there are tons of meta-analysis in SSRIs, like over 100, and isn't it an indication that something is awful going on in the field, that you need so many meta-analyses to demonstrate that a particular intervention is effective? But the point is that, just to cut the long story short, that what has been shown is that if the first author is affiliated with pharma industry, then he or she is 22-fold less likely to report a negative result about the outcome of the treatment. And in that sense, in psychedelic research is not that malignant. At least there is, at the present moment, there is not much financial interest, in my opinion. But I mean, there are some disturbing trends that I'm concerned about.
Yeah. Thank you. Anybody else from the panel want to add before we open up? Okay, let's hit it. Do we have any questions in the audience? Of course. Tom, do you want to? Yes, go ahead. We'll get your mic to you. 1 second. We'll turn it on.
I tried to describe the problems with ketamine, that it actually they are waiting for the results of a study that has been ongoing quite a lot. It seems that Swedish authorities need sort of Swedish studies before they can come to a decision, and this has been ongoing quite long, and we wait for the results now. But it was allowed to do the study anyway. That's quite good. But I think really these other drugs will be more difficult to get permission from the authorities. But what's your view on this?
My question will be twofold. So first, when it comes to actual implementation of psychedelic-assisted therapy, that's one part. So I think we are quite far from that. Even for as a part of the compassionate use program, which is implemented, for instance, in the Switzerland, it's already working, the compassionate use program for desperate cases. But in the Swedish laws, the Läkemedelsverket interprets this regulation that at least one phase 3 clinical trial should be conducted, large-scale clinical trial should be conducted, and with positive results, for them to consider an opportunity to run to employ a certain intervention as a part of the compassionate use program. So that's one way. But speaking about the research, that perhaps deserves a separate consideration, because of course I am interested in getting things going here in Sweden. And we have recently completed a clinical trial with L-DOPA, a very well established and widely used drug in Parkinson's. And that was a challenge. And we were targeting a healthy population. That was a purely experimental study. We were not interested in any clinical outcomes. That was very clear from the EP and from the ethics that we need to run a clinical trial. And the way things look to me right now, if we are to do a study with psychedelics in Sweden, it will most likely be a clinical trial. But I cannot be 100% certain. It also depends on many small things. But we will try. So I know that I am definitely interested in that. And my PI at the Department of Clinical Neuroscience at Karolinska, he's interested in that. So we are going to try. I know many researchers at Karolinska in general are interested, but the problem is that approximately half a year ago I tried reaching out some of the senior researchers who would be interested in helping out with setting up a clinical trial, and there are many challenges. It's not just something that you can do, on weekends, evening. It's a very challenging project, and you need to take care of a clinical site, a place where you are going to run a clinical trial. And well, unfortunately, a lot of senior researchers are supportive during the interaction, but I think they are very careful when it comes to practical support. That's my impression.
Thank you. More questions? Yeah, we have the mic over there. You can send it to guy in orange shirt.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi.
Thank you.
Yeah, quickly just wanted to ask, with the landmark news coming out of Canada today, what the response would be that, marijuana is often looked at as the gateway drug. If you see it as a positive thing coming for the research, and the rest of the world being that it's the, second country and the first industrialized nation to do this. And, if you guys will wait and see and what that entails over the next couple of years. And of course, for the Swedes, again, a large country that has good relations with the West, if you would see that will open up doors as well for studies related to psychedelics, as well as perhaps marijuana and other things, as that's also been tied into depression and things like that, and CBD becoming a big name, and companies such as Coca-Cola and Marlboro now being, attracted to investing in the business.
So if I understood it correctly, I'll just reiterate if I understood you, was basically the change in opinion and also the legalization of cannabis basically in Canada and some states in the States. How do we see that affects the possibility for this type of research both internationally and in Sweden? Anybody want to jump on that one? No takers, sorry. I'm kidding. Alicia, maybe?
Yeah, surprisingly, in the insular clinical bubble I've been in, we haven't been looking at cannabis so much. One conversation that is emerging is cannabis is becoming more readily available for non-clinical purposes. It's raised the issue of the difference between the type of research we do with synthesized compounds versus whole plant medicines. Questions of access of something that you can grow in your own backyard versus something that's a standardized dose and a synthesized setting, administered by licensed clinicians, it kind of has a little bit of a feeling of apples and oranges. I think it remains to be seen what potential influence that might have. In our experience, I'm often told how difficult it must be for us to battle it out with all the regulatory agencies, but frankly, the FDA and the DEA have been very agreeable as long as we've been willing to jump through all the hoops, but that hasn't been the case for cannabis. They've been more obstructionist and there have been more barriers, so it's a little difficult to compare our route to medical cannabis. It has a very different history, and the very frank, honest answers, I don't think about it that much because I don't see the overlap. It might prime the pump, so to speak, and make the general public more open to considering these types of medicines that alter consciousness for therapeutic effect, but I'll be interested to see how it plays out.
Mats, did you want to jump in?
I would like to say that the case of marijuana or cannabis is a good example of that you shouldn't really run to too fast, quick conclusions on things, because the latest years of research has showed that, for instance, one of the constituents, the cannabidiol, CBD, seems to be a powerful antipsychotic treatment, which is really very good. But this has sort of, to some extent, probably disguised the fact that tetrahydrocannabinol causes psychosis, and because it's a mixture of these two, and this shows the problems with to just let anyone use such powerful drugs for self-treatment or something. I would strongly advise against that.
Thanks. That's a very, very important thing to point out. It sounds like we're legalizing one substance internationally, of course, can change the story about drugs, especially I think in Sweden, because we only have one word for it. In the States, you talk about drugs as like, yeah, I take my headache pills. That's also drugs. Where in Sweden, we just categorize it as one thing. But at the same time, it seems like differentiating and not self-treating without doing proper research and knowing this is a very young field could be very, very dangerous as well. Okay, another question? Okay, go ahead. Actually, I'm not the one deciding. I'll go ahead in the back, and then we'll go to you. Yeah. Thanks.
What are known risks and negative effects of psychedelic drugs?
You want to jump?
I think I should begin to answer that question, because during the 1990s I lecture in Sweden about the possible risks of MDMA, ecstasy, because there were signals at that time that this drug could have neurotoxic effects with chronic damage to the serotonergic system. And I've tried to follow this research since then, and in that respect I would say that it's quite clear that the low dosages that are used in these present trials, that there is probably no risk at all of that kind of effects, but in the same time we don't really know if individual subjects could be more sensitive than others, and that there might be a risk for this, because it's quite clear evidence that people that have used high doses for repeated periods, they may have this kind of damage that has been clearly shown in experimental animals. So I think that this risk seems to still be there to a very small extent. In this kind of very responsible use, I think it's almost negligible. but it also shows the problems with sort of letting people use these drugs for themselves, because that could really be problematic, in my view. In the same time, I should say that with psilocybin, there doesn't seem to be any documents of this kind of risk, so that's a different thing.
Yeah,
Add anything to that?
I'll just add it. So your question is, what are the risks, the known risks? And I think that, at least for the classical serotonergics, the medical risks are very, very low. We see some increases in blood pressure and pulse rate, but in people with well-controlled hypertension, the medical risks are basically very negligible for most people in a well-supported setting. We tend not to take people who have risk for psychotic disorder, psychosis, and we don't really have any good research in that population, are people who are at risk for a manic episode. So that's certainly something to consider. We're very thoughtful about the people that we recruit and that we accept into these clinical trials. But I think when you ask the question, what are the risks, and certainly in unsupervised settings, the settings not at a medical institution or a hospital or a supportive clinic, the most famous risk for most psychedelics are psychological events, right? It's not that the person has a heart attack, it's that they have a bad trip or a very difficult experience, and they freak out. And I just want to speak to that, because I think it's important, right? We spend, like I said, a lot of time working with the participant to think about their mental mindset going into the experience and the setting that they are in, so that they feel a sense of security in that space. And yet, these substances can be very powerful psycholytic agents. They bring up material for people, they remember events, sometimes they access traumas, sometimes they work on things about themselves that they really don't like and they might want to change. And sometimes people, and what we do see is transient, but people do experience feelings of fear, feelings of sometimes anxiety in the session, sometimes short-lived even panic, and people can get quite scared. But we think that this is actually not only to be expected, but to be embraced as part of a healing journey for people. And in all of our trials, we find that these experiences of fear and panic and anxiety are well resolved interpersonally with the therapist team. The person says, I was really, really scared, but I held up my hand and the therapist was there to hold me, and I knew that I could be safe and that I could work through the process. So the person feels bad things, but it's part of an arc, and they come out of that arc feeling senses of relief, feelings of forgiveness, feelings of peace, feelings of coming to a greater acceptance. And unfortunately, in an unsupervised setting, like if you're on the sidewalk, or if you're at a big concert and your friends aren't there to support you, it's not an ideal setting. You could have a very strong experience, and it's important to think about what kind of setting you're in, because those settings are not necessarily the optimal setting. Many people have very safe, and these are largely safe and naturalistic settings, but in our trials we're trying to minimize risk by situating the medicine use in context with other human people, so that the people are there to support them if they do have an experience of difficulty.
Also ask a very quick follow-up question, and I think it's a really good question, because that's the question that many of us keep asking ourselves. And I really wanted you two guys to comment on that. I mean, I know that you work with people with autism, Alicia, and I mean, when I had a conversation with some of my colleagues at Karolinska working with these patients, they were a little bit surprised, I have to admit. I mean, of course, you work with adults, and you know, you are targeting a very specific condition in this population, social anxiety. But I keep asking myself, what would be a patient? I mean, of course, you already mentioned, Alex, people with immediate history of psychotic disorders, and I know that even people with immediate history, family history, if their relatives suffer from schizophrenia spectrum disorders, they're also being screened out. But what are other people who you would really seriously consider to exclude from this study? You know, perhaps people with some severe personality disorders. What's your take on borderline personality disorders, or some other patients who are unstable emotionally? That's what I'm really curious about.
I can speak to that directly because it's already come up across teams, sometimes with the pressure of deadlines and budgets and the sort of urgency around getting people enrolled. And in the process, it has been the case that the clinicians have not had adequate time to find underlying personality disorder that wasn't readily apparent. And often, ironically, that happens after clinician referral, because clinicians are interested in offloading a challenging case, and they think, well, I don't know what to do, maybe this will work, and they don't disclose if you don't ask them very explicitly. On our current trial, for this reason, we've added the SCID PD to assess specifically for personality disorders. And on a case-by-case basis in the current study, we have enrolled individuals who have traits, but with very, very careful attention to who is in the group. What is the level of functioning of the group as a whole? And so far, to my knowledge, there's been no specific data, there's no data published on this, but just in exchanging anecdotes amongst clinicians, almost all of the teams have realized at a point, like, there's something else going on here. And the general consensus is that individuals with personality disorders, and specifically borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, they can improve. It just takes longer, and maybe it's not as much, but I've been asked, multiple times, what do you think is what are the most promising areas in this field of research? And I think it's such a breakthrough, beginning with Catherine McLean, a research psychologist at Johns Hopkins, published a paper with data that support the view that the domain of openness can increase. So there's an anchor to can serve as a foundation for further research on how psychedelic-assisted therapies can influence personality, how they might be helpful for populations that have, often been considered challenging or even untreatable. So that answers that part of that question. Yeah. Other populations, I think, quite obviously, would be individuals who cannot provide informed consent. I think it's essential. These substances alter consciousness so much that it would just be unethical to introduce them if someone didn't have an understanding of what the expected effects would be. And because of autism, one of my biggest struggles is the immediate association with children. But I absolutely do not recommend providing this therapy to children. I've thought about this very deeply. I think someone needs to reach the age of consent and be able to make an informed decision about what they want for themselves. So I'm opposed to this work with children. That's my personal bias, and individuals who, couldn't be expected to provide informed consent.
So